Good to see you, Ambassador Herbst. As you know, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's next summit in Samarkand will be an opportunity for leaders of Russia and China to meet face to face for the first time since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. We remember they last met a few weeks before the special operation. So it is a very special event and meeting for them. So how would you describe the relationship between China and Russia today? I mean, are they friends? Are they allies? Are they rivals? What are they?
They are uncomfortable partners.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Um, they are the leaders of two countries that historically have had bad relations. Two powerful countries with a long shared border, and it's normal that such countries have bad relations. Currently, they are for the second time in 75 years, trying to have much closer relations. In both cases, back once Mao took over in China, uh, a um, brief closeness characterized only by hostility towards the United States, and at that point, more broadly, the capitalist world. Today, it's hostility towards the United States and its allies and partners. That's a very thin reed for good relations. And I think their partnership is uncomfortable at the moment in ways that it was not when they met last. Because when they met last, she blessed Putin's war of war crimes on Ukraine, which I suspect both dictators thought would end quickly and favorably for Russia. Instead, Russia is losing its war of war crimes. They were defeated in the battle for Kiev and the north of Ukraine. They are now bogged down in the east, which was their second objective, and they appear to be losing territory in the south. Xi has maintained his public support for Russia, but he is observing the sanctions, not sending weapons to Putin. Putin's getting his weapons from Iran, and now he's hoping to get them from perhaps North Korea. And I think Xi is embarrassed by Putin's failure, and Putin has been seriously weakened by his failure. 6 months ago, everybody was talking about the growing strength of global authoritarians. Today, we're seeing the number two authoritarian stuck in a war against a country which seems to be far weaker, and a newly unified West against Moscow. 6 months ago, when they met, Xi thought maybe he could take Taiwan by military means. I think now he's wondering, as he watches what second and third rate American weapons are doing to Russian forces in Ukraine, what first rate American weapons could do to him in the Taiwan Straits. So I think it'll be very amusing to watch their meeting, their body language in Samarkand, because they thought they were riding the wave of the future 6 months ago. Now it looks like the authoritarians are stumbling.
How long do you think this deepened, strengthened relationship will last, given the protracted nature of the war in Ukraine?
Well, this is just a warning to Xi that Putin's reckless and dangerous to him, to Xi, as his partner. But more importantly is the fact, again, that historically China and Russia do not get along. China is the ascending power. Putin's Russia is a declining power. Even as China is trying to have good relations with Moscow, it is not hiding its territorial ambitions vis-a-vis Moscow. It's not just Chinese academics and Chinese uh, journalists who write about Russian territory as historically Chinese. You even had a Chinese diplomat at their embassy in Islamabad talking about Vladivostok as a Chinese city. So, Putin is fooling himself that China and Xi are his pals. There are smart China experts in Moscow who know that China is a danger to Russia, because China is the bigger, more powerful nation, but who realize that in Putin's Russia, you can't talk about that.
We haven't seen China on a battlefield against a serious rival. And if a war in the Taiwan Strait breaks out, how do you think it's going to go?
Look, I'm not a military expert. I've read some things about the Taiwan Strait. I know that conducting an amphibious operation is a very difficult matter. The United States historically has excelled at that, first in the Pacific during World War II, and then most spectacularly at D-Day, on D-Day, across the English Channel. I also suspect that the successful D-Day invasion of France in 1944 was far easier to achieve than an amphibious landing on Taiwan, especially if the United States were somehow to become engaged in it. But even without that, again, look at what second-rate and third-rate American weapons are doing against Russia in Ukraine. We know, the Chinese know we're selling better than second-rate and third-rate weapons to Taiwan.
What are the major disagreements between China and Russia at the moment?
Well, they downplay the difficulties in their relationship. But I think the core problem between those two countries is the historic one of large, powerful countries neighboring each other. And so from a Russian standpoint, again, being the weaker power, having valuable assets far from its center, is that those valuable assets are at risk. And again, China is right now trying to be nice to Russia, but even as it's quote unquote trying to be nice, its academics, its journalists, and even its junior diplomats are talking about Russian territories belonging to China. That's key. But then of also importance is the fact that while China has become an alternate market for Russia, as Russia's aggression in Europe is spoiling the European market, China is not responding as if Russia is a worthy partner. China is demanding very advantageous terms in their economic relationship. So if Putin is antagonizing the West and cannot sell the products in the West at the price he would like, he's willing to accept a lower price from China because he's not going to complain to his big brother about being treated like a little brother. You can be sure that people in Moscow understand what I've just said, even though they will not talk about it under the increasingly repressive Putin regime.
Gazprom has just said that they have an agreement with China about making the payments for energy products in yuan and ruble as opposed to the dollar. And I think more and more countries will be switching to alternative ways of payment methods. Do you think the United States should be worried about this?
I don't think I'm not sure many more countries are going to make that switch. There's a lot of talk about this as people complain about the strength of the dollar and the centrality of Western created financial institutions. But, it's not as if people around the world or in the global South are idiots. They understand that there's a ruthless regime in Beijing. The countries of East Asia recognize that growing Chinese economic power is probably more dangerous to them than the American economic power, which is underscored, and the Western economic power, which is undergirded, not underscored, the global financial system. And watching the way China treats Vietnam, the Philippines, in the South and the East China Seas, they see that this is dangerous. So again, even if they're concerned about some of the measures taken by the United States and its allies in the international financial system, they recognize the readiness of China to take advantage of a financial system which it controls is much more threatening than what exists today.
Perhaps these smaller countries can use the situation to their advantage by playing the big powers against each other.
Well, they may try that, and so I'm not suggesting that China and Russia together will experience no progress in trying to create an alternate system. I just think it will fall far short of what we have today and may not get very far at all.
And how does this Russian-Chinese relationship affect Central Asia? We know that most of the Central Asian states border both Russia and China. Will this partnership limit their desire to engage more actively with the European Union or the United States?
I think it certainly increases their interest in closer relations with the US and the EU, and for that matter, Japan and South Korea. Central Asia is probably the worst geopolitical terrain in the world, surrounded by two large predatory powers, and also very close to a third smaller predatory power, Iran, and then an unstable nation like Pakistan, a failed nation like Afghanistan. Oh, so they're looking for better relations with countries far less aggressive but also powerful. Again, the United States, countries of Western Europe, Japan, and so on. And while I think from a Central Asian standpoint, it's good that Russia and China are not fighting because that's also dangerous. They do have to worry about a Russia-China condominium in Central Asia. You have that a little bit right now in the sense that, Russia does security and China does economics. Although we're seeing China also move into security, that base in Tajikistan, for example. Uh, and again, my sense is the leaders of Central Asia would like to see a greater US presence, greater EU presence. And they also cultivate, again, Japan and South Korea.
And how should they behave in the current situation? Specifically, let's say Uzbekistan. What should their policy be at the moment?
Uzbekistan has always been the most independent of the Central Asian states because they're the ones that didn't share a border with Russia, a very big plus. And they were meticulous in the first days or first years after independence to make sure that ethnic Uzbeks, were in control of all the major power institutions in the country. A sensible measure. And of course, under Mirziyoyev, Uzbekistan fixed the one serious flaw in Karimov's foreign policy, which was his, at a minimum, indifference, but actually quasi hostility towards his neighbors. Mirziyoyev understands that the need for Uzbekistan, for Central Asia, for there to be cooperation amongst all five former Soviet republics. And that's important to boosting the region against China, Russia, and any other threat. And so we've seen steps in that direction. Even just recently, you had the meeting at Issyk-Kul, right? And this has been a constant theme over the past several years. Then you had the subsequent meeting on South and Central Asia again, under the new circumstances with Taliban rule in Afghanistan. Again, a sensible approach.
What is the biggest reason for China to side with Russia given the current circumstances? We know why Russia is embracing China because it has no other choice. But what's in it for China?
In China, as in Russia, there has been the decision to pursue a revisionist foreign policy, meaning a foreign policy designed at an absolute minimum to substantially change the rules of international behavior, if not to upend those rules entirely. In Russia's case, this has been the constant policy of frozen conflicts with its neighbors, and then outright war with Georgia and now Ukraine. In the case of China, it's been this very aggressive policy, largely at sea, to claim um, ocean territory, again, in the East and South China Seas, and with it, the resources, hydrocarbons that lie on the seabed. And so these preposterous claims, it seems like any place any Chinese ship ever sailed 600 or 700 years ago, the Chinese claim as theirs. And this building of islands, turning reefs into islands. And the assertion of those claims with gunboat diplomacy. It's quite ironic that China, that complains bitterly about Western gunboat diplomacy in the 19th century, is currently conducting gunboat diplomacy against much smaller neighbors. And of course, a land war against Vietnam in 1979, which Vietnam won, or at least Vietnam fought them to a draw, which was the same as a victory. So people see these aggressive Chinese policies that have emerged over the past 15 years. And it's that aggressive policy in Beijing which has a substantial overlap with the even more aggressive foreign policy in Moscow. And that is the basis of their relationship. That's a very unstable basis which will not last.
Ambassador Herbst, is the war in Ukraine affecting China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, I think that the Belt and Road Initiative, which was held in high regard, say as recently as 7 or 8 years ago, now is looked at with good suspicion. People have noticed how these economic terms work with these Chinese projects around the world, which often lead to Chinese control over geographical areas in foreign countries, jobs for Chinese workers and not so much for local workers. And while, yes, a leader who takes a bribe will benefit personally, the countries that make these arrangements do not seem to benefit. So the Belt and Road Initiative now looks like more a vehicle for Chinese economic imperialism than for global development. And again, Xi made a serious mistake in aligning himself closely with Putin as Putin launched this wanton war. And the Chinese are embarrassed.
There are many Uzbeks who are in Russia and who get their information from the Russian media. Some of them are on the Russian side and they think that the West does not understand Russian motives in this conflict. Do you think that the West does not understand the Russians' motives? Because there is one school of thought that thinks that it is just an imperialist approach by Russia trying to expand. And then the others say Russia is just trying to secure its borders by using Ukraine as a buffer zone, like the Soviet Union did in Eastern Europe. What is your thought on that?
If Central Asians believe that Russia has a historic right to use its neighbors as a buffer zone, then they believe that it's perfectly acceptable for Moscow to control or even dominate their own countries, right? Kazakhstan borders Russia. We know what Putin said at Lake Seliger in August of 2014, just a few months after he began his war on Ukraine, right? That his genius pal Nazarbayev created a country out of something that never was a country, and that they right now under Nazarbayev treat ethnic Russians well, but if they don't, well, Russian policy will have to change. And we know there are Russians who believe that northern Kazakhstan is properly Russian. Maybe Uzbeks who are working in Moscow think the same way. We all know that Moscow once controlled Uzbekistan. So maybe those Uzbeks in Russia think that should happen again. I suspect that most Uzbeks in Uzbekistan don't feel that way. And I suspect that Uzbeks, whether in Moscow or in Samarkand, who have access to good information on Russian policy, would agree with that. So if you believe that Russia has the right to de-Ukrainianize Ukraine, then yes, Western policies are wrong. But if you believe that Ukrainians have a right to live as Ukrainians in their own country, then obviously Putin is is a massive aggressor, is a big aggressor, and needs to be stopped.
Ambassador Herbst, do you think this war could have been prevented if Russia's only demand for limiting NATO's enlargement was met?
I think that's a preposterous excuse offered by the Kremlin. In 2014, or rather in 2013, this crisis began because Moscow said no to Ukraine signing a trade agreement with the EU. That's how this crisis began. And in 2013, when this crisis began, Ukraine had a constitution which said they are neutral, will never join, a foreign security pact. This began because Putin did not want Ukraine to have a trade relationship with the EU, not because Ukraine was on the verge of joining NATO. Those are the facts.
How long do you think this war will last?
I am confident that Ukraine will not lose this war. So the war will end when the regime in Moscow realizes it cannot impose its will on Ukraine by war. That could happen tomorrow, although I don't expect it will happen tomorrow. It might take 5 or 10 years for it to happen. I am convinced if support from the US and the West for Ukraine at least stays at its current level, Ukraine will win. Because the people of Ukraine, 95% of them or more, are willing to fight for their right to exist as Ukrainians in Ukraine. The people of Russia don't really support this war. This is Putin's war. It's not even the war of the Siloviki. If you watch that strange video, the few days before Putin began his war, all of his Siloviki advisors were around him, and they all looked uncomfortable. He even criticized one of them. And if you watch that equally strange video that happened the weekend after the war started, where Putin was talking to Shoigu and Gerasimov about declaring a state of nuclear alert, they didn't look happy or confident either. This is Putin's baby, and it's a disaster for him, and a disaster for his regime, and a disaster for Russia. Sweden and Finland are now going to be members of NATO, directly as a result of this aggression. What does that say for Putin's statesmanship?
You mentioned that Ukraine will not lose. But what does victory mean for Ukraine? Because as of today, they are losing territory, of course, with a smaller extent than it was, let's say, a few months ago.
What this means is that Ukraine will emerge as a fully sovereign state in control of its domestic and foreign policy within secure borders, although what those borders will be, I am not certain at the present time, within viable borders, which means they will retain Odessa and a Black Sea coast and the ability to create a strong economy. They will not be a rump state. The exact territories of the state that emerges remain to be negotiated. But I would suspect if Ukraine is not in full control of its territory, that serious sanctions would remain in place, imposing an ongoing cost for Kremlin aggression.
And the last question. Do you think the upcoming winter will affect the Western resolve to keep helping Ukraine, given the high energy prices in Europe?
I think it will be a difficult winter for Europe. I think that they've already made impressive gains in limiting the damage, but the damage will be real. You just had this demonstration in the Czech Republic, which cannot be dismissed. And we may see other demonstrations of that kind, but not enough to change the policies and not enough to change the outcome of Western, let's say the extent of Western opposition to Putin's war in Ukraine. And by next spring, more measures will be in place to limit Moscow's ability to use hydrocarbons as a weapon against Europe in the future. So if we're still in this situation, in this war, in a year, we'll be looking at a winter that will not be as difficult as the one we in Europe face this year.
Assalomu alaykum qadrli tomoshabinlar, xalqaro hayot
Dunyoning qaysi nuqtasida bo'lishingizdan qat'iy nazar
Assalomu alaykum. Amerika xalqi va hayoti.
Fevral oxiridan buyon 3,5 milliondan ziyod Ukraina